We trust doctors with our lives, we trust teachers with our children, and when someone we love dies, we trust those who prepare the dead for their final resting place with something sacred. How that life is remembered, and how that body is laid to rest. We never question that the person handling our dead will do so with dignity, care, and reverence. We assume it. We don't ask to see the crematory. We grieve, we pay, and we believe. That trust is what makes the case of Jon Hallford so deeply disturbing. Hallford wasn't a stranger to the profession. As a third-generation funeral director, he was raised among rituals of reverence and responsibility. Families turned to him in their most vulnerable moments, believing that they were placing their loved ones in the hands of someone who understood the weight of that responsibility. He spoke their language, he wore the title, and he carried the legacy. But what he did with that trust would end up shaking an entire community and challenge everything we assume about those who care for the dead. Welcome back to the channel. Or if it's your first time, welcome. If you appreciate thoughtful storytelling that digs far beneath the surface, take a moment to support the channel. Subscribe if you haven't already, and drop a comment below and let me know what you think about this case. I cover cases like this to spotlight not just the crime, but the systems and the silence that allows it to happen. In this episode of Black Rhetoric, we discuss the case of Jon Hallford and the lengths he went to keep up the facade of being a preeminent professional with a perfect life, and the devastating effect of his crimes and the impact they've had on the whole community. Let's get started. John Michael Hallford was born and raised in Wagner County, Oklahoma, the third generation in a family of funeral directors. Now, from an early age, taking care of the dead was a part of his environment. It was normal, almost routine. I mean, that's the case usually when you come from a family in a specific profession. His family had operated funeral homes for years, and it gave John a somewhat front row seat to the rituals and responsibilities that come with caring for the dead. He would later claim nearly 2 decades of experience in the industry and probably reference a graduation from Dallas Mortuary School. To clients, this background gave him a lot of credibility. He wasn't just a business owner, he was someone who had the family tradition, someone who understood what families needed during their worst moments. But there were signs that something wasn't quite right. In 2006, while still living in Oklahoma, John was involved in a high school prank that crossed way over legal lines. He and others staged a faked armed robbery, but they used real firearms. Though no one was physically harmed, the stunt ended up having some serious consequences. John was charged with multiple misdemeanors, and he was forced to drop out of a city council race that he had entered. And so many would say that this incident showed that John wasn't just immature. He liked to take risks. He liked to blur the lines between what was okay and what wasn't okay. There's not a lot of public details available about John's childhood, but what we know, it seems like it was mostly a mixture of the privilege that I've talked about, coming from an established family, and a lot of pressure. He was expected to carry on the legacy, to maintain the family name in a business that, as I've said, is built on trust. Some could say it's easy to imagine how those pressures, combined with a lack of finances or personal shortcomings, might cause someone to do something immoral. But from what I read about John, even so, the funeral profession became more than just a job for him. It was his identity. That fusion of self and occupation, particularly in an industry when the stakes are really high, can be dangerous if you don't have the ethics. And what we've heard about John, what I've read about John thus far, he really didn't. Still, at some point in the early 2010s, Jon moved to Colorado with his wife, Carrie, and in 2017, the two of them founded Return to Nature Funeral Home. The business marketed itself as a provider of eco-conscious green burials. There is no embalming, no harsh chemicals, just biodegradable materials is what they used, and a natural, less processed, less environmentally damaging return to the earth. Jon's pitch was compelling to customers. It gave them a sense of feeling spiritual, modern, and environmentally friendly at the same time. And Jon leaned into this narrative, telling families that not only did he have 20 years of experience, that this was also his calling. He made himself, you see from the articles and the videos and the interviews, that he made himself the face of a progressive approach to funerals and death care. As I referred to, though, and hinted at previously, there were financial problems already brewing, though. When Jon and Carrie founded Return to Nature Funeral Home in 2017, it was a concept that appealed to families. They wanted something more natural, but still affordable. And so with that spur of business, by 2019, they were able to expand their operations to a second remote facility in a small rural town called Penrose, Colorado. It was there where the business really took quite the dark turn, and we see Jon's immorality and how far he dove in the profession, taking to the ultimate lengths. Almost immediately after he got that second facility, problems began surfacing. Crematories that had worked with the Hallfords, including one called Wilbert Funeral Services and Roselawn Cemetery in Pueblo, ended their partnerships with the Hallfords. The Hallfords were not only behind on payments, they were unresponsive to communications, and they were called increasingly erratic. Despite these relationships that got severed, bridges burned, the couple, they continued to accept bodies. The funeral homes, the funeral services, I should say, Wilbert to be specific, the cemetery, they all stopped doing business with the Hallford. And yet they kept taking bodies and taking payments from families, promising cremation services that they couldn't deliver. Whether they might have delivered them previously, but they no longer could. So with, as harsh as this is to say, bodies piling up, the lack of space, the Hallfords began storing the remains of the loved ones that were brought in the Penrose facility. And over time, the number of corpses just kept growing and growing and growing. Dozens, tens of dozens. Dozens of bodies accrued that were neither cremated nor buried. And by late 2020, the building had become an improvised storage site for the dead. Now, at this facility, there wasn't proper refrigeration, so these bodies were literally piled inside the facility, perhaps outside the facility in some cases, in the elements, without a thought to keeping them cool. The remains were literally stacked on top of each other, and in some cases, it reached shoulder height, so anywhere from 5 to 6 feet high. Some would go on to say that the floors were even slick with decomposition fluids, the fluids that were seeping from the bodies. There were insects throughout the facility, thick in the air, and a noticeable smell started to seep out into the community that surrounded this facility. Still, throughout this period, families were being told that their loved ones were cremated. They were given death certificates, they were issued them, for the most part listed falsely third-party crematories as the processor of the remains. And these were not clerical errors. Investigators later confirmed that the crematory's name had not ever received or handled the bodies in questions. The Hallfords had fabricated all their certificates. Lied, basically. So they had said that they were taking in the bodies and processing them in natural ways, when in reality, none of this was happening. Sadly, instead of ash, they filled the urns and containers with dry concrete powder. In some cases, the substitute material contained bits of metal to mimic bone fragments. The Hallfords were adding bits of metal so that it seemed like bone fragments. The families who would test these contents of their urns, of course, were devastated to learn that they contained no trace of their loved ones. They were giving dry cement. One mother described how she had been handed a sealed container after her husband's supposed cremation. When she opened it and added a few drops of water, it began to set like cement. Another woman, Angelica Stedman, learned her daughter's body had never been cremated at all. Instead, it had been abandoned in a funeral home for years, left to rot in a broken freezer, and later replaced among nearly 200 other decaying remains. Now, behind the scenes, the Hallfords were well aware of this chaos that they themselves were bringing about. Text messages recovered by investigators show that Jon and Carrie discussed ways to cover up the growing problem. They considered burning the bodies themselves, digging mass graves, and using lye to dissolve the remains, or building, quote-unquote, a new machine to dispose of them. Jon even weirdly joked in one message about getting a double cheeseburger after handling bodies, which honestly is just a disturbing sign of just how emotionally detached he was from what he was actually doing. In early fall of the following year, so we'd be about at 2023, residents and business owners around that Penrose facility began reporting that smell, the foul odor that was coming from the building. At the same time, the seemingly vacant building caught the eye of a pair of prospective buyers. So they walked around the property. It was warm and it was September, and they smelled that strong odor. They also noticed liquid seeping from the building. They go in, notice the smell, but no one's around, so they leave. 2 weeks go by and they return to the property again to look at it. It's the beginning of October, and the smell was still there. In fact, it had reached all the way to the post office down the street. They could smell it there. And the suspicious liquid they noticed was still leaking. So they called the Fremont Sheriff's Office, who responded to the building, but concluded it was just what they said, the smell of doing business, the smell of taking care of the dead. Days later, several nearby business owners would go on to complain about the smell. And on October 4, 2023, the Fremont County Sheriff's Office responded to the scene of the Hallford's facility in Penrose for a second time. When deputies arrived at the building, they were met by Jon Hallford himself. And in an odd attempt to explain away the odor, Hallford told them that he was doing taxidermy work inside the building. Suspicious but not fully aware of the scale of what was unfolding, authorities obtained a search warrant. The next day, October 5th, investigators entered the building and uncovered what can only be described as a horrifying scene. Nearly 190 decomposing bodies, not refrigerated. Some were in body bags, some were wrapped in plastic, body fluids across the floor, and the air was so toxic that responders had to wear protective suits and respirators. The bodies were in various states of decay, and the site was eventually described as a mass casualty scene. In the immediate aftermath of the discovery, Jon Hallford attempted to deflect blame, of course. Doesn't seem to take responsibility, doesn't seem to be mature enough for the job that he has. He told regulators that he had been practicing taxidermy again, which didn't hold up at all. There was no animal remains, no taxidermy animals to be found. Not only that, but forensic teams would go through and identify the remains, cross-checking them with fraudulent records, and could clearly see that they were human beings and not animals. More investigation revealed that the Hallfords not only had failed to cremate or bury nearly 200 individuals, they had also collected more than $130,000 from families for those undelivered services. Not only that, but they also got the loans that went out during COVID-19, the COVID relief loans, under false pretenses, claiming that they had all these employees, so the PPP loans, and got $900,000 in COVID relief that they didn't actually use for its intended purposes. Instead of using them to pay the business or to pay employees, they bought luxury vehicles, spa treatments, cryptocurrencies, and plastic surgery. Of course, the emotional fallout for families was immediate and intense. One man would describe laying awake every night wondering whether his mother had just been left there on a shelf, exposed, naked. Another victim would share how his 11-year-old son fell into a depression, thinking about how his grandmother's remains had been faked and he had to eventually go to therapy and have a psychiatric stay. Another family member would say that they were horrified when they found out that the remains that they had scattered were fake. Now, the Hallfords would be indicted in April 2024. Now, in the federal indictments that happened in April 2024, it would also be revealed that the Hallfords lied on applications not only for the COVID relief, but to evade child support obligations. So again, Jon really lacks the morality to be in this profession whatsoever if he doesn't even want to pay the proper child support. The state charges that they received totaled over 280 counts per person, including 191 cases of corpse abuse, counts of forgery, theft, and money laundering. Notably, Jon expressed guilt in private text as far back as 2020, saying, quote, "My one and only focus is keeping us out of jail," end quote. After the initial October raid, the Hallfords did flee. They were eventually arrested in Oklahoma around November 2023. Jon posted a bond in late 2024 for $100K, and Carrie would post a bond shortly after. In March 2024, the Hallfords pleaded guilty in federal court to conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Jon accepted the plea, while Carrie would later withdraw hers, choosing to contest the charges in an upcoming trial. On June 27, 2025, Jon received a 20-year federal sentence, the maximum under the plea, a full 5 years of what the government recommended, which Judge Nina Wang emphasized the scale of the emotional devastation. I mentioned those stories of dozens of families, almost 200 families, victimized. Now, Jon, I don't really buy that he's remorseful, but he did say in court that he opened the funeral home to make a positive impact, and everything got out of control. And he did apologize for his actions, saying, "I hate myself for what he's done." But there were numerous times when Jon could have stopped what he did, and he chose not to, continuing to lie. What do you say about the COVID-19 relief fraud? How does he justify that? Hey y'all, just have to pause the video to give a quick update. I originally recorded this video all the way back in July 2025, and it is now October, and I'm about to release it now. But of course, there are updates in the case. So Carrie Hallford, previously she had pled not guilty, but in, August, she changed her plea to guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Her sentencing will be in December. Now, Jon had previously pled guilty to state charges, and the prosecution had proposed a 20-year sentence. But Jon was supposed to go to get sentenced in August. In a surprise turn of events, the judge said that, no, I'm going to reject this plea agreement because it doesn't take into account the number of victims nor the victim's experience, which is quite surprising that the prosecution didn't take into account input from the victim. It seems that's what the judge is saying. But let's get back to the video. In August 2024, a Colorado judge did issue a symbolic $950 million judgment in a class action civil suit, which represented about $5 million per victim. As far as criminal restitution, Jon was also ordered to pay over $1 million, with about $200,000 going to the families and the remainder back to the SBA. Now, one thing is for sure that all this being revealed in the Hallford case really shows that there was not enough oversight happening with the profession that they're in. The state didn't require any licensing for funeral directors. There was no formal inspections, and the Hallfords didn't have to have any academic credentials to do that job. Thankfully, prompted by this scandal, the 2024-2025 Colorado legislation has introduced licensure, apprenticeship requirements, and regular inspection requirements, which are expected to become effective in 2026. Still, the emotional toll of this case cannot be overstated. Dozens of families believe that they had honored their loved ones through cremation or burial. They thought they had done their civic duty by doing it in a natural way. Sometimes they didn't scatter ashes at all because there were no ashes. Some people still don't even know what happened to their loved ones. So the psychological impact, grief compounded on top of grief, is a betrayal. And it's gonna last long beyond the Hallfords' sentencing and any time that they get. I mentioned that Jon had multiple opportunities to just stop and not do this. But to be greedy, to keep taking payment, and to dishonor the deceased in such a way is not only criminal, it's depraved, it's immoral, and the families will have to continue to deal and grapple with the trauma. So as much time as the Hallfords might spend behind bars, it will never be enough to reverse the harm they caused and the trust they broke. It won't ever be enough. And this concludes today's story. For more true crime cases, check out the Black Rhetoric homepage. And for another story like this one involving deception across multiple continents, check out the video on one of the most infamous catfish in the world. Until next time.